A white police officer pulls over a black woman's car, but when he sees her tattoo, he freezes. Why? What does this tattoo mean, and how is it connected to both the officer and the woman? A routine traffic stop turns into a shocking revelation. What truth behind this mysterious tattoo? Stay tuned to find out the full story, only on H2 Black Thread. Don't forget to leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest videos. Let's begin.
The town of Willow Creek was always quiet at night. It wasn't a place where much happened, just a sleepy suburban community surrounded by dense woodlands, the kind of town where everyone knew each other. For Officer Daniel Carter, these late-night patrols were routine, often uneventful. But tonight, something felt different. The roads were nearly empty, save for the occasional trucker making their way to the next town or a night owl heading home. The air was crisp, a light mist rolling over the asphalt under the glow of the streetlights. Daniel sipped his coffee, letting the warmth settle in his chest as his patrol car hummed along Maplewood Drive, a stretch of road lined with tall oak trees that swayed gently in the wind. Then he saw it. A silver sedan, moving erratically, weaving slightly between lanes. His instincts sharpened instantly. Over a decade on the force had given him an almost unnatural sense for trouble. His first thought was DUI, maybe a tired driver or worse, someone under the influence. He flipped on his siren, the red and blue lights slicing through the darkness, reflecting off the damp pavement. The sedan slowed before rolling to a stop at the shoulder of the road. Daniel took a deep breath, adjusting his duty belt, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of his holstered gun. Routine stop, nothing more, he told himself. But there was something gnawing at him, a feeling deep in his gut he couldn't shake. Stepping out of his patrol car, the sound of his boots crunching against the gravel filled the silence. The silver sedan idled in place, its exhaust curling into the night air. He approached carefully, his flashlight sweeping across the car's sleek surface before stopping at the driver's window, which slowly rolled down. The woman behind the wheel was young, probably in her mid-20s. Dark brown hair framed her face and striking emerald-green eyes met his. There was something about her gaze, calm, composed, yet guarded. Daniel kept his expression neutral. "Good evening, ma'am. License and registration, please." The woman didn't argue or act nervous like most people did when pulled over. Instead, she silently reached into the glove compartment, her movements smooth and deliberate. When she handed him the documents, his gaze flicked to her wrist, and that's when everything changed. A butterfly tattoo, small but incredibly detailed, inked just above her wrist bone. For a moment, Daniel couldn't breathe. The world around him blurred, the sound of the highway fading into the background as his mind spiraled 20 years into the past. He was just a kid, barely 16, when Sophie had begged him for a tattoo. "Come on, Danny." "Just a small one right here," Sophie had pleaded, pointing to her wrist with excitement. "You know Mom and Dad will freak out, right?" Daniel had chuckled. "They won't even notice," she grinned. "Please, it's just a butterfly, it'll be like a piece of me forever." Daniel had caved in, carefully sketching the butterfly on her skin before taking a makeshift tattoo needle he had learned to use from a friend. The tiny inked wings had meant the world to her. And then, 1 year later, Sophie disappeared. Gone. Vanished without a trace. The town searched for weeks, posters with her face plastered across telephone poles and shop windows. The woods near their house had been combed over and over again, but nothing. No signs, no leads, no body. Eventually, the case went cold. Daniel had spent the next 2 decades living with the weight of her absence, replaying the last moments he had with her, wondering if there was something, anything he could have done differently. And now, here it was, her tattoo, on the wrist of a complete stranger. Daniel felt his pulse hammering in his ears as he forced himself back into reality. He quickly regained his composure, tightening his grip on the documents to steady himself. His voice, though controlled, came out slightly strained. "That's an interesting tattoo." The woman glanced at her wrist before slowly pulling her arm back. There, that hesitation. It was subtle, just a flicker, but Daniel caught it. She knew something. "Mind if I ask where you got it?" Lena's lips pressed together. A pause. A split second too long before she spoke. "It's not mine," she finally said, her voice careful. "My mother gave it to me." Daniel's blood ran cold. His fingers curled around her driver's license as the name Lena Thompson blurred before his eyes. Her mother. His mind raced, piecing together the impossible possibility. Could it be? Could Sophie, his Sophie, still be alive? His stomach clenched, his throat dry. He wanted to ask more, demand more, but years of training held him back. Stay professional, stay in control. He forced a polite nod, schooling his face into neutrality. "Your mother, she had the same tattoo." Lena's gaze flickered again, almost imperceptibly, but Daniel didn't miss it. "Yeah," she said slowly. "She told me it was important, a symbol of hope." Hope. Sophie had always been hopeful, even in the darkest times. Daniel swallowed hard. He needed answers, but this wasn't the place. Not on the side of a dark road, not during a routine traffic stop. He took a breath, forcing himself to push down the storm roaring inside him. He had to be sure. If there was even the slightest chance that Lena's mother was his sister, he needed to find out the truth. But first, he had to be careful. He handed Lena back her license. "Everything looks good here," he said, keeping his voice even. "But be careful on the road. Drive safe." Lena nodded, rolling up her window as she prepared to pull away. Daniel watched her car disappear into the night, his fists clenched at his sides. His heart thundered in his chest. He knew what he had to do next. He needed to find out who Lena's mother really was, because if his instincts were right, Sophie was alive, and she had been out there all along. The Carter family home sat at the edge of Willow Creek, bordered by a dense stretch of woodland that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. For many, those woods were a place of adventure, a sanctuary where children played, built forts, and chased fireflies at dusk. But for Daniel Carter, the trees had long since become a prison of memories, a reminder of what he had lost. And it all began with a butterfly. Sophie Carter had always been different. Where other children found excitement in cartoons or games, Sophie found wonder in the natural world. She was fascinated by the way the wind rustled through the trees, how the morning dew clung to blades of grass, how the river behind their house hummed with the quiet energy of life. But nothing captivated her quite like butterflies. "They're magic, Danny," she had once told him, her voice filled with absolute certainty. Daniel, 5 years older than her, had merely chuckled at the time. "They're just bugs with fancy wings, Soph." She had gasped in outrage, dramatically clutching her heart as if he had just insulted her entire existence. "They are not just bugs. They're proof that you can change, that you can be something more than what you started as." Daniel never forgot those words. And one summer afternoon, when Sophie was 10 years old, she came running up to him, her face flushed with excitement, clutching a small butterfly sticker in her hand. "Tattoo this on me," she demanded. Daniel, lounging on the porch, raised an eyebrow. "What?" "I want a butterfly tattoo right here." She pointed at her wrist, her small fingers brushing against the delicate skin. Daniel hesitated. "Sophie, that's permanent." "I know. Mom and Dad will kill me. Not if they don't find out." She flashed him a mischievous grin. At the time, Daniel had been 15, caught in that awkward transition between childhood and responsibility. He wasn't a tattoo artist. He was just a kid who had picked up a makeshift tattooing kit from a friend at school. It was harmless, he had reasoned. A small thing, a favor for his baby sister. So, under the golden light of that summer afternoon, he inked the butterfly onto Sophie's wrist. She had sat perfectly still, barely flinching as the needle worked. And when it was done, she beamed, tracing the outline of the delicate wings. "It's perfect. It's just a butterfly, Soph." "No," she whispered. "It's me." Daniel never imagined that it would become the last thing he had left of her. It happened on a gray autumn afternoon. Sophie, now 11, had gone out for her usual walk in the woods behind their home. It wasn't unusual. She spent hours there, sometimes sketching flowers, other times just watching the sky change. She always came back before dark, but that day she didn't. When dinner time came and Sophie was still nowhere to be seen, their mother, Margaret Carter, had called out into the backyard. No answer. An hour passed. Then another. Panic settled in. Daniel still remembered the way his mother's voice cracked as she called the police, the way his father, Robert Carter, grabbed a flashlight and disappeared into the woods, shouting Sophie's name. The entire town searched for weeks. The police brought in dogs, neighbors organized search parties, helicopters flew over the treetops, but there was nothing. No footprints, no sign of a struggle. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Daniel blamed himself. He should have gone with her. He should have made sure she was safe. "If I had been there, she wouldn't have disappeared," he told himself over and over. But there were no answers. The woods, once Sophie's sanctuary, had become a void of silence. Months passed, then years, and eventually the case was closed. People told Daniel to move on. But how did you move on from losing someone who was a part of you? He carried Sophie's memory everywhere. In the quiet moments before sleep, in the rustling of leaves on a windy day, in the sight of butterflies flitting through the air. Most of all, he carried her tattoo in his mind. That tiny, insignificant butterfly haunted him. Every time he saw someone with a tattoo, his breath caught. Every time he heard a case about a missing person being found, hope flickered inside him, only to be extinguished again. Years turned into decades, and eventually Daniel stopped hoping. Until tonight. Standing on the side of the road with Lena Thompson's wrist inches away, Daniel's world tilted. His mind couldn't process it. After 20 years, he was staring at the exact same butterfly tattoo. Sophie's butterfly. No, he refused to believe it was coincidence. He wanted to demand answers from Lena, to shake her, to ask, "How do you have this? Where did you get it? Who gave it to you?" But he didn't. Because Lena had already answered. "My mother gave it to me." The words rang in his ears. My mother. Daniel swallowed hard. His throat was dry. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he fought to control the storm raging inside him. Could it be? Could Sophie be alive? He felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him. He had spent 20 years mourning her, believing she was lost forever. And now this woman, this Lena Thompson, stood before him with Sophie's tattoo on her wrist. The world suddenly seemed too small, too fragile, too unreal. His voice, when he spoke, was barely a whisper. "Your mother, she had this tattoo too," Lena hesitated. It was slight, just a flicker in her expression, but Daniel saw it. She nodded. "Yeah. She told me it was important, a symbol of hope. Hope. Sophie's hope." Daniel exhaled slowly, trying to keep himself together. He needed to think, to process. If there was even the slightest chance that Lena's mother was his sister, he had to find out the truth. But not here. Not now. He forced a polite nod, his emotions buried beneath years of self-control. "Drive safe," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. Lena rolled up her window, the silver sedan disappearing into the darkness. Daniel stood there for a long time, staring after her. The past had finally caught up with him, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. Sophie was out there, and he was going to find her. The night air was thick with tension. The rhythmic hum of crickets filled the silence between them, but for Daniel Carter, the world had stopped. His fingers trembled slightly as he gripped the worn, frayed photograph that Lena Thompson had handed him. The dim glow from his patrol car's headlights illuminated the image just enough for him to see her face. A young woman, smiling softly at the camera, her eyes. They hadn't changed. Those eyes. He would have recognized them anywhere, even after 20 years. Even after he had forced himself to believe that she was gone forever. Even after he had tried and failed to let go. His baby sister, Sophie Carter, was alive. Daniel's heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out the distant sounds of the night. His vision blurred as he traced the edges of the photo, his thumb brushing over the faint image of Sophie's delicate wrist. The butterfly tattoo. It was there, exactly as he had inked it all those years ago, just a little faded, a little worn, but unmistakable. It was real. This wasn't some cruel trick of the mind or a mere coincidence. He felt his throat tighten. He had buried her in his heart, convinced himself she was never coming back, and yet she had been out there all along. His sister, alive, breathing, somewhere in this world, and for 20 years he had been living a lie. His grip on the photograph tightened. He looked up at Lena, his chest rising and falling in rapid succession. His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse. "Where is she?" Lena hesitated, and that hesitation told him everything. She was holding something back. Daniel's sharp instincts as a cop kicked in, but this was personal. This wasn't some suspect he was interrogating. This was his sister's daughter. Lena shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, her hands tightening around the strap of her bag. "She never forgot you," she finally said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "Not for a single day." Daniel's jaw clenched. Then why didn't she come back? Lena bit her lip, looking away. The faint glow of his patrol lights flickered across her face, and for a brief moment he saw it, pain, not just hesitation. Pain, and that's when it hit him. Something had happened to Sophie, something terrible, that's why she never came home. Daniel exhaled slowly, trying to push down the burning feeling in his chest. "Tell me everything," he said, barely managing to keep his voice steady. "Please." Lena hesitated again, and Daniel could feel his patience fraying at the edges. She knew something. She had an answer, and he needed it. "Lena." His tone was sharper now, edged with a desperation he could no longer contain. "Where is she?" Lena flinched, as if she had expected this moment but still wasn't ready for it. Then, slowly, she sighed. "She wanted to come back," she murmured. "But she couldn't." Daniel stiffened. "Couldn't," Lena nodded, swallowing hard. "Something happened. Something bad. She never told me everything, but I know she was scared." Scared. Daniel's stomach twisted. His sister had been living in fear for 20 years. His entire world tilted on its axis. Lena's gaze drifted downward, her fingers tightening into fists. "She built a new life," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "She changed her name. She never stayed in one place for too long." Daniel felt a cold chill run down his spine. His sister, his Sophie, had been on the run. From what? From who? His hands curled into fists as he tried to contain the anger boiling inside him. Someone had taken her. Someone had hurt her. Someone had stolen 20 years from her, and she had been too afraid to come home. Why? Who did this to her? He took a deep, shuddering breath, his hands shaking as he dragged them through his hair. His voice came out ragged. "Did she ever try to find us?" Lena's expression softened. "She did," she admitted. "She searched for years. She kept up with everything she could find about Willow Creek. She never stopped thinking about you." Daniel closed his eyes, his chest tightening. "But she thought it was safer this way," Lena added. "For you, for all of you, safer." safer. The word rang in his head like a gunshot. What the hell had Sophie been protecting them from? The silence stretched between them, thick with words left unspoken. Daniel couldn't take it anymore. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Take me to her." Lena's eyes widened slightly. "Daniel," she started, uncertainty creeping into her voice. "Please." His throat tightened as he swallowed hard. "I need to see her." Lena looked at him for a long moment, and then, finally, a nod. The ride was silent. Daniel followed Lena's car down the winding roads of Willow Creek, his fingers tight around the wheel, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The night seemed endless, stretching ahead like an empty highway. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. What would he say to her? What could he possibly say to someone who had been gone for 2 decades? What would she look like? Would she recognize him? Would she still be Sophie? His heart pounded harder with every mile. The moment he had dreamed of, grieved for, begged for, it was finally here, and nothing in the world could have prepared him for what came next. The drive was silent. Daniel followed Lena Thompson's car through winding streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The tension inside him coiled like a spring, each second stretching into eternity. This was it. For 20 years he had lived with grief, regret, and unanswered questions. For 20 years he had convinced himself that his sister, Sophie Carter, was gone forever. And now, in a matter of minutes, he was about to see her again. Alive. He swallowed, his throat dry as dust. Would she still be the same? Would she recognize him? Would she even want to see him? The thought made his heart pound against his ribs. The streetlights flickered as Lena's car turned onto a quiet suburban street. The houses were modest, each one tucked neatly behind small yards. It wasn't the kind of place Daniel had pictured his sister ending up. But then again, he had stopped picturing anything for her a long time ago. Lena's car slowed in front of a small, single-story house with a white picket fence. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow against the dark night. The place looked ordinary, peaceful, yet to Daniel, it might as well have been a foreign land. His chest ached as he parked behind Lena and cut the engine. For the first time in years, he felt afraid. Afraid of what he was about to find, afraid of what he might have lost. Lena stepped out of her car and glanced back at him. She didn't say anything, she didn't have to. Her expression said it all. This is it. Daniel exhaled slowly, then pushed open the door. His boots felt too heavy as he stepped onto the pavement. Each footstep felt like a lifetime of waiting compressed into mere seconds. Lena led the way up the short walkway to the house, her pace steady but measured. She paused in front of the door, hesitated for a brief moment, then knocked 3 times. The sound echoed in the night, each knock pounding in sync with Daniel's heartbeat. Then the doorknob turned. Daniel held his breath. The door creaked open, and there she was. Daniel's world stopped. There, standing in the soft glow of the porch light, was Sophie Carter, his little sister. The little girl he had spent a lifetime searching for, except she wasn't a little girl anymore. The years had etched themselves onto her face. Faint lines that hadn't been there before, strands of gray woven into her once vibrant auburn hair. But her eyes, God, her eyes, they hadn't changed. Those same bright, deep, soulful eyes he had seen every day of their childhood, the ones filled with wonder and laughter. The ones he had seen in every dream, every nightmare, every memory. Sophie. His voice caught in his throat. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. He could only stare, unable to move, unable to breathe. Her lips parted, her eyes widened. Tears welled up instantly. She gasped, barely able to get the words out. Daniel, and that was all it took. The dam broke. Daniel moved before he could think. 1 second he was frozen in place, the next, he was running toward her. Sophie let out a soft sob, her hands covering her mouth as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Then, She was in his arms. They crashed together, arms wrapping tightly around each other, holding on like they would never let go. Sophie buried her face in his chest, her shoulders shaking as sobs racked her body. Daniel clutched her desperately, his hands gripping the back of her sweater, his face pressed into her hair. "Oh my God, Sophie!" His voice was thick, broken, raw, with 20 years of grief. She gasped between sobs, her fingers digging into his back. "I thought I'd never see you again." Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, tears slipping down his face. He had spent so many nights wondering if she was even alive. Now she was right here, shaking in his arms, as real as the stars above them. She was here. She was alive, and she was home. They held onto each other for what felt like forever. Neither spoke, neither needed to. For 20 years, words had been nothing but echoes of what was lost. But this was real. The sound of their quiet sobs, the warmth of Sophie's touch proving that she wasn't just a dream, the way Daniel could finally breathe again. When they finally pulled apart, Daniel reached up and cupped her face, brushing away the tears that streaked her cheeks. His voice was hoarse, still thick with emotion. "You look different." Sophie let out a wet, broken laugh, swiping at her eyes. "So do you." Daniel chuckled, even as his own tears slipped down his face. "Well, yeah, it's been 20 years." Sophie's face crumpled, her lips trembling. "I'm so sorry." Daniel shook his head immediately, squeezing her hand. "You have nothing to be sorry for." But she did. And the story she was about to tell him would change everything. Lena stood nearby, silent but watching. She knew what was coming. The truth. The real reason Sophie never came home. Why she had stayed away. Why she had lived in fear for 20 years. Sophie sniffled, blinking away her tears. She needed to say it. She had kept this buried for too long. Her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper. "Daniel, there's something you need to know." Daniel's breath hitched. "What is it?" Sophie hesitated. Then, with a shaky breath, she spoke. And everything changed. The weight of 20 years hung in the air like a thick fog. Inside Sophie's small but warm living room, Daniel sat on the worn couch, his hands still trembling from the overwhelming flood of emotions. The reunion had been raw, powerful, and utterly life-changing. But now, there was one final piece of the puzzle missing. The truth. Why had Sophie never come back? Why had she been forced into hiding for 2 decades? Daniel's heart pounded as he watched his sister, his Sophie, sit across from him, her fingers laced tightly together in her lap. She looked nervous, as if saying the words out loud would make the pain real all over again. Lena sat beside her mother, one hand on Sophie's shoulder in quiet support. Sophie inhaled deeply, her gaze locking with Daniel's. "There's something you need to know." Daniel leaned forward, bracing himself. "Tell me everything." Sophie let out a shaky breath, her fingers gripping the fabric of her sweater. "I was kidnapped," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. He had imagined so many possibilities over the years, runaway, accident, even something far worse. But this was something else entirely. That night. "I was walking home," Sophie continued, her voice haunted, "and someone was following me." Daniel's hands curled into fists. "I thought it was my imagination at first, but then he grabbed me." Lena's grip on her mother's shoulder tightened. Daniel asked, his voice low, dangerous. Sophie swallowed hard. "His name was Martin Graves. I didn't know him, but he knew me." The name meant nothing to Daniel, but rage boiled inside him regardless. "He had been watching me for weeks," Sophie whispered. "He knew my routine, he knew where I lived, he knew I loved the woods." Daniel's heart shattered. His sister had been stalked right under their noses, and no one had known. "He took me far away," Sophie continued, her voice shaking. "Locked me in a basement. I don't know how long I was there. Days, weeks, time didn't feel real anymore." Daniel clenched his jaw so tightly it hurt. I tried to escape, she admitted. He caught me, punished me, but I never stopped trying. Lena looked away, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She had clearly heard this story before, but it didn't make it any easier. Then one night he slipped up. Daniel's gaze snapped to her. He forgot to lock one of the doors, she exhaled shakily. I ran. Daniel's breath was ragged as he absorbed every painful detail. I didn't stop running, Sophie whispered. I had no ID, no money, I was a missing person, I couldn't go to the police. Daniel felt sick. How many times had he trusted that the system would find her? How many times had he prayed for a breakthrough, for someone to recognize her face? And all the while, Sophie had been out there alone. I changed my name, Sophie continued. I moved constantly, I never stayed in one place for too long. Daniel closed his eyes, his heart aching at the sheer loneliness his sister must have endured. I wanted to come home, Sophie admitted, but I was scared. What if he found me again? What if I put you all in danger? Daniel shook his head violently. You should have told me. You should have let me protect you. Sophie's eyes were filled with unspeakable pain. I was protecting you, Danny. And that was when Daniel realized Sophie had been running, not just for herself, but for all of them. Silence settled in the room, heavy but no longer unbearable. Lena squeezed her mother's hand gently. I grew up hearing about you, Lena said softly. Mom always told me about her big brother, the one person she never stopped missing. Daniel exhaled sharply, his emotions overwhelming him. Sophie had never forgotten him. She had never stopped loving him, and in her absence she had made sure Lena knew about the family she had left behind. Lena had been more than just a stranger on the road that night. She had been the bridge that reunited a family lost to time. Daniel stood up, crossing the room in 2 steps, and pulled Sophie into another tight hug. She held onto him just as fiercely. You're home now, Daniel whispered, and you're safe. Sophie choked back a sob, nodding against his shoulder. Lena wiped at her eyes, watching the two of them, knowing that everything had changed tonight. Daniel introduced Sophie to his family the very next day. His wife embraced Sophie without hesitation. His children listened in awe as their long-lost aunt told them stories about the uncle they thought they knew so well. For the first time in 2 decades, Daniel felt whole again. The ache in his heart didn't disappear overnight. But now there was no void, no unanswered questions, no haunting grief. There was only a beginning. That night, as the family sat together, laughing, crying, reminiscing, Daniel caught sight of Sophie's wrist. The butterfly tattoo was still there, a little faded, a little worn, but permanent, just like she had wanted. A symbol of hope, a symbol of survival, a symbol of family. And in that moment, Daniel realized something. Sometimes the smallest symbol, a tattoo, a memory, can lead us back to the ones we love.